Hey, what's up, everybody? Britt Oates here, coming to you from my home again in Northridge, California. And of course, big shout out to the local indigenous community whose ancestral lands I currently reside in, and that's the Fernandino Tatavian Band of Mission Indians. So, this is Black Representation in Anthropology Part 2, My Beef with Anthropology. And in this one, I'll be mostly focusing on the formal or academic study of anthropology. And there's a lot to unpack there. Definitely is a lot to unpack there. But what I'm going to try to do is just lay out some basic kind of foundational information and then jump into my main concerns or my beef with the discipline of anthropology. So let's do it. First, to give a quick refresher on the basic definition of anthropology, anthropo means human or relating to humankind, and ology means a specific subject of study. So, of course, the term anthropology means the study of humans. Traditionally, any term with ology as a suffix implies that it at some point in history became a formal study in academia or higher education. But what's interesting is that nowhere in the actual definition of the term ology says that it means the formal or collegiate study of a specific subject. Now, I'll come back to that point a bit later, but you may remember from my part 1 video me saying that all people conduct anthropology in one way or another. And that's because when we think about it, all of us are constantly studying each other, ourselves, and how the world around us impacts our lives, and vice versa, as a means of making our way through life. We learn from an early age that in order to do certain things, we have to take steps toward those achievements through observation and learning. Like riding a bike, for example. Most of us start with training wheels to get the feel for mobility and how to maneuver ourselves while in motion. Then the training wheels are removed at some point, and through practice, we learn to balance ourselves while in motion. Before we know it, we're popping wheelies and doing tricks all over the place without even thinking twice. For non-academics, this is just living life and growing up, right? But for academics studying anthropology, learning how to ride a bike is often seen as a major milestone or rite of passage in American culture. Anthropologists mostly come up with these sorts of conclusions based on a research method called participant observation. This means that they live among certain groups of people, observe and participate in the daily routines, or as often called in anthropology, rituals of that cultural group over a certain period of time, usually long enough to be able to observe consistent behavioral patterns and the meanings behind those patterns. Quick side note / mythbuster. A lot of people may hear the term ritual and immediately think about creepy, evil, cult-like behavior, and even the term cult itself is often associated with those vibes as well. But mainstream media and pop culture over the years have gravely misconstrued the meaning of those terms. A cult means a group of people typically connected through maintaining and practicing specific religious beliefs, usually centering a specific figure or being. In other words, it's a religious group. And a ritual simply means meaningful repetitive behavior, like brushing our teeth every day or praying before eating a meal. Different cultures engage in different kinds of rituals, but every culture has them. And anthropologists are supposed to observe these behaviors without being what's called ethnocentric, which is believing that a person or group of people from a different culture is inferior simply because they do or believe in things differently than we do. Now, us Black folks can understand being on the receiving end of that kind of bias. The point here being, don't believe the hype, do your research, and don't be ethnocentric. Going back to participant observation, this concept was introduced to American anthropology in the early 20th century when researchers argued that they could get better results by physically immersing themselves into the groups they were studying. Now, when I learned about this in college, the first thing that came to mind for me was, duh. I mean, you can't talk the talk unless you walk the walk, right? That just seemed like common sense to me. I find it interesting that anthropology as a discipline seems to have this kind of monopoly on that phrase, when again, we all do this all the time. Like our first day at a new school or a new job, for example, where we observe and practice till everything becomes natural. So then, when wanting to genuinely and authentically learn about people, you practice doing the things they do and living the ways they live, right? AKA participant observation. So what does all of this have to do with my beef with the formal study of anthropology? Well, it really stems from the foundations of higher education itself being built on principles of elitism and the seeming contradictions associated with these two main characteristics of the discipline of anthropology. Those characteristics are holism and, as mentioned previously, anti-ethnocentrism. The establishment of higher education in Western civilization was initially for higher class or elite individuals. And even though things have progressed and today higher education is much more accessible, there are still social and economic inequities that primarily impact people of color, which continue to make access to education imbalanced for underserved groups. And even today, in a society which claims to provide equal opportunity for employment, housing, loans, etc., having credentials from an accredited academic institution can and does sadly make or break one's livelihood, especially for individuals from marginalized ethnic groups like me. Even if someone from an underprivileged group does go to college, success is still not guaranteed. I can't tell you how many potential employers have rejected me over the years because of my lack of a master's degree or PhD, despite my extensive work experience and, as you can probably tell, my super dope personality. And on top of that, the pursuit of a bachelor's degree has resulted in having to be indebted to student loan agencies for literally the rest of my life. And without generational wealth to back me, I'm stuck between deciding to finish pursuing a graduate degree and increasing my debt, or settling for jobs that leave me overworked and underpaid. Quite a vicious cycle for a person living in the land of the free. But the most upsetting part, and fair warning, at the risk of being stereotyped as the angry Black woman, what I've got to say next might sound a tad hostile. So, to quote the incomparable Samuel L. Jackson from his famous line in the first Jurassic Park film, "Hold on to your butts." Remember earlier I talked about the irony of the term ology and how nowhere in its definition does it mention the formal or collegiate study of a subject? Well, it bothers me so much because everyday aspects of life, as part of our natural learning, along with the chance to expand our knowledge of the world, have been turned into a money-making business full of programs oversaturated with mostly the same information we already learned in high school, only dressed nicer, put together in neat packages that cost obscene amounts of money, time, and sleepless nights, all for the promise of a better future that in reality we may never actually see. All the while, we got snobby academic anthropologists in colleges and universities and in anthropology groups all over social media telling inexperienced undergrads that if they want a career as an anthropologist, they have to pick one aspect of the discipline to focus on and get a graduate degree and a PhD, or they won't be considered a real anthropologist, which is, dare I say, bullshit. Which leads me to my next issue. Anthropology claims to be a discipline that incorporates holism, meaning taking an all-inclusive approach to understanding the human condition. My takeaway from this is that anthropology should be promoting autonomy or free-thinking research within the discipline as a reflection of that holistic approach to understanding humanity. This should also include research that transcends all the subfields. I think it's ridiculous to force someone to pick just one focus. For me, I love it all. I strive to incorporate cultural anthropology and archaeology in my work as a museum professional, and I love to dabble in a bit of biology along the way. And really, what's wrong with that? Especially considering that if we really stop and think about those subfields, they definitely go hand in hand. For example, and bear with me on this, linguistics and communication are aspects of culture which can be discovered through human artifacts like ancient archives buried deep under modern cities, which might be sitting on top of an even more ancient mass grave belonging to a civilization of people biological anthropologists might study to figure out what environmental factors cause their deaths, which might be impacting human life today. So, it's somewhat illogical to have to pick one facet of the discipline to make our life's work, and pretty boring if you ask me. That's not holism. Something else I've noticed is that despite this claim that anthropology is a holistic study, there tends to be quite a bit of gatekeeping when it comes to what is considered legitimate anthropological insights and research. I've even been told in school that my theoretical approach to conducting experiential ethnographic research, or my own cultural research through personal experience, was not anthropological enough because I did not include an exhaustive amount of references to similar research done prior to mine, despite making it clear that my research was a new theoretical approach of my own creation. This left me feeling discouraged and confused given anthropology is supposed to be holistic, right? And what I thought was open to exploring new ideas. But it turned out, I guess I should have been following precedents or the footsteps of anthropologists before me. In another instance, when I inquired with one of the subsections of the American Anthropological Association about submitting insights to an anthropology journal, I was told that at minimum I needed to have a master's degree to simply be considered for submission, but a PhD is most definitely preferred. Again, not very reflective of that holism concept and definitely feeling the academic elitism with that one. And that actually ties in with my next issue, which is concerning the concept of anti-ethnocentrism. Remember, ethnocentric means the belief that a person or group of people from a different culture than your own is inferior, which is kind of a fancy academic way of saying racist or prejudice. But somehow this concept is not always applied within the anthropology community itself. The biggest example of this for me is in the teaching of anthropology. We are taught research methods based on the foundations of anthropology, which comes from anthropologists in the early days of the discipline. We're required to read till our eyes bleed about how scholars from the early 20th century define and practice anthropology, like Franz Boas, known as the father of American anthropology, and then scholars like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, and of course, white man after white man after white man. But out of all of the classes that I ever taken, not once were we ever assigned reading about Zora Neale Hurston, who studied directly under Franz Boas himself and went on to become an incredible anthropologist of Black folklore in the American South and one of the greatest writers in Black history. We didn't even discuss her in the folklore class that I took as an undergrad. I mean, what the hell is that about? Nor did we ever talk about John Wesley Gilbert, the first African-American archaeologist, and who was also the first to map ancient Eritrea in Greece. And he was a civil rights activist focusing primarily on equal opportunity for education for Black people long before the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. These were two very significant people in anthropology, but somehow their work is not part of the standard anthropology curriculum. Oh, and remember earlier I mentioned how some snobby academic anthropologists say that you can't be a real anthropologist unless you get a master's and a PhD? Well, here's a fun fact about our beloved Black anthropologist extraordinaire, Zora Neale Hurston's highest credential, which was a bachelor's degree. Maybe that's why she doesn't get much recognition in the discipline. Today, Black anthropologists are more often than not focusing on research related to the African diaspora, which is very important work. But I do find that it's almost a typecast sort of pathway for aspiring Black anthropologists. And even so, that work sadly is not amplified like the kind of research we see on, National Geographic specials or the History and Discovery channels. I think it's important to recognize that Black anthropologists don't have to settle for research specific to Black concerns and Black history if they desire to pursue other research interests as well. If anthropology as a discipline is to truly uphold its claims of anti-ethnocentrism, then it definitely needs to do better to recognize and amplify not only research being done under its own roof that doesn't fit the standard whitewashed lens, such as work involving the African diaspora, but also the discipline must normalize anthropologists of color conducting all sorts of research. It was really frustrating at times being the only Black student in my anthropology courses in college, but that tells me that the discipline has definitely got some internal work to do in order to show the world that it is a true reflection of the holistic and anti-ethnocentric discipline it claims to be, and not just another money-making entity under the business of education in this country. As I've said before, I love anthropology. In fact, I've been doing anthropology long before I knew what it was or even how to spell the word. But while I appreciate the foundational education I've received in the discipline, it's clear that the institutionalization of anthropology definitely needs work. Till then, I'll be continuing to do it my way. So be on the lookout for Black Representation in Anthropology Part 3, where I will be spotlighting some remarkable Black anthropologists from past to present who inspire me to do the work that I do today. Peace and one love, y'all.